Your pens are an eyesore. Claudine Harrow spat on what I'd spent my whole life building. But she had no idea that the resort lake she loved to brag about depended on the damn valve I controlled. When the lake turned into a mud pit and dead fish floated white across the surface, I said just one thing: justice has come, Claudine. This wasn't just revenge. It was proof that even the powerless can flip the table. What state are you in? Is your state as oppressive as the one I live in? I remember that morning clearly. The sun had just risen over the treetops when a piercing noise shattered the stillness. I ran out into the yard, my steps frozen as I took in the scene before me. The pen, built board by board, beam by sturdy beam, the place that had fed my family for years, were being torn apart into splinters by the massive bulldozer sent by the HOA. Dust billowed through the air, and broken timber flew in every direction. The engine's roar echoed like it was devouring my memories and pride whole. I rushed forward, screaming until my voice cracked, but the hired workers kept operating the machine like I wasn't even there. They averted their eyes, like men who knew they were doing something wrong but didn't have the spine to stop. I threw myself in front of the bulldozer, but a cold female voice rang out behind me and froze me in my track. Claudine Harrow, president of the HOA, stepped down from a gleaming SUV parked along the roadside. Her light-colored suit stood out against the dusty chaos, making her look even more vicious in contrast. She held her chin high, surveying the wreckage, just pleaded something noble. Then she spoke, each word sharp as a blade and aimed straight at me. We don't allow this kind of eyesore near the resort. You should be grateful I cleaned it up for you. My chest tightened, blood surged. My hands shook, but my voice rang out, steady and loud. You don't have the right to destroy what I built. These pens are sweat and survival for my family. Who do you think you are? Claudine took a step closer, polished shoes crunching over the shattered wood. She looked down at me with a half smile, cold as steel. Right? Here, Jonas, I am the law. This lake, this neighborhood, its property value. It's all under my control. You're nothing but a leftover farmer, out of place. I don't need a cattle shed polluting the view from the lakeside villas. Her words hit like a hammer. I looked around. A few residents stood at a distance, watching quietly, none daring to come closer. One of them even smirked as I stood in the rubble. The shame and rage surged up my throat until I could hardly breathe. I remembered the late nights hammering nails, the early mornings raising wooden frames, my son's laughter echoing through the horse stalls, all of it now crushed beneath bulldozer track. Claudine looked at me like she had just claimed victory, not even bothering to hide her contempt. Don't waste your energy resisting, Jonas. If you want to live here in peace, you'd better learn to bow. We have standards and you do not. I clenched my fists until my knuckles cracked. I could feel hot blood pulsing under my skin. Every bit of restraint, every quiet endurance over the years was reaching its limit. I stepped closer, just a few feet between us. My voice dropped, cutting through the air, each word sharp as glass. You picked the wrong man. Claudine paused for a heartbeat, then let out a dry laugh and turned away. Her luxury SUV rolled off, leaving behind nothing but dust and ruin. The bulldozer engine went silent. The workers scrambled to pack up, not one of them meeting my eyes. I stood there in the wreckage, filled with fury. My son came running out, his face stricken with fear. He looked at the wrecked pen, then turned to me, his eyes welling with tears, his voice trembling as he asked, Dad, why are they doing this to us? I couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come. I just placed a hand on his shoulder and felt the shaking in his small frame. In that moment, I understood clearly. This wasn't just about the pen. This was a calculated humiliation, aimed straight at my family's dignity. A message that in the eyes of the HOA, we didn't belong here. I looked up at the shimmering lake in the distance. There, the luxury villas flaunted themselves in the sunlight, and the powerful sipped wine, treating other people's loss like some form of entertainment. In that moment, I made myself, this game wasn't over. Claudine might she is the law, but she would soon learn that the law is not something an arrogant human can hold on to forever. I turned around and led my son back into the house. Behind me, the wind still carried dust from the demolished pens, coating each step I took with heavy grit. But inside, fire had been lit, and that fire would not die out until I took everything back. The residents' meeting was held in the hall by the lake, a place once promoted as a symbol of civility and unity. I walked in, and every gaze immediately turned to me, cold and scrutinized. A few subtle shakes of the head, a few whispers loud enough for me to catch. They talked about the crushed pens as if they proved my incompetence, not the HOA's wrongdoing. I knew full well that tonight, Claudine Harrow wasn't just going to talk about the pens. She wanted to turn me into a laughingstock, shore up her faltering grip on power. Claudine arrived last, walking with blatant arrogance. She strode up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and scanned the room, her sharp eyes passing over each person. Then she stopped at me, raised her slender finger, and pointed straight at my face like she was singling out a criminal. Her voice rang out, every word clear and laced with contempt. He is the reason property values are dropping. Look at what he brings. A rotting pen, a messy landscape. Is that the kind of face we want next to a resort lake? No, ladies and gentlemen, we deserve better. The room filled with murmurs of approval. Some residents nodded, others clapped along. Mocking laughter sparked corners of the room, cutting through the air like blades to my ears. I stood up, took a deep breath to keep the anger from spilling over. My voice wasn't loud, but it rose above the laughter. People are not numbers for you to negotiate with. You can't assign a price to dignity and self-respect based on a real estate report. If you think property value matters more than the integrity of the people who live here, you are unfit to lead this community. There was a moment of silence, brief and sharp, before another wave of smug laughter swept through. Some leaned back in their chairs, grinning. One muttered, "What does a farmer know about leadership?" But I also saw a few residents lower their eyes, avoiding mine. They said nothing, but their silence said enough. They knew I was right, just not brave enough to say it out loud. Claudine smirked, her smile that of a victor ready to devour her prey. She turned back to the crowd, her voice even but venomous beneath the surface. "You see, this is what he brings. Disruption, defiance, a stain on the image of our neighborhood. I ask you, are we going to let someone like drag Lakeshore down, or are we going to stand together to protect the prestige of our community?" The applause rose again, louder this time. I could feel it. Claudine was trying to make me the common enemy, the scapegoat to tighten her control. Every laugh, every condescending glance was fuel to the fire building inside me. I locked eyes with Claudine, refusing to look away. "You can wipe out my pen, you can mock me in front of them, but you'll never erase the truth. The truth is, you look down on people like me, pick and choose who stays and who gets pushed out. But remember this, every insult threw at me tonight, I'll carry it, and I will back." The room fell silent for a few seconds, then the murmurs returned. Claudine stepped back, her face tightening before she could recover that practiced smile. She lifted her chin, signaled her secretary to record the minutes, trying to appear in control. But I had seen it, the flicker of unease in her eyes. Claudine wasn't used to being challenged in public, especially not in front of the resident. I returned to my seat, heart pounding. I knew I had become the center of the meeting, but that didn't make me shrink. On the contrary, every word she had just sharpened into a jab became an arrow I would one day send back. I remembered every detail, every look, every sneer. They would be my evidence, fire that would keep me moving forward in this fight. When the meeting ended, I walked out of the hall under a storm of loaded glances. Some people looked away, others gave me a mix of pity and fear. A few of the older residents nodded slightly, a silent admission that they understood but dared not speak. I didn't blame them. I knew Claudine had turned fear into her weapon of control. Outside, the wind from the lake slapped cold against my face, but it couldn't chill the burning in my chest. I knew this public shaming was only the beginning. Claudine had thrown down the gauntlet, and whether I wanted to or not, I had stepped into the ring. I couldn't back down. More than that, I will never forget what she said today. That night, I sat alone in the quiet house. My son had long fallen asleep. I stared out the window, where the lights from the lakeside villas shimmered on the water. In my mind, her laughter and insult echoed like a talk chorus. But shame no longer lingered, only a cold resolve. Claudine wanted to make me the face of inferiority. Then I would show her. Even a symbol can become the fire that burns down a false throne. I closed the notebook where I had recorded every word Claudine spoke during the meeting. Each line was a carving, a mark, and I told myself, this isn't just my battle. It's for the silent ones, the ones who bowed their heads out of fear. Claudine thought herself untouchable. That arrogance would be her trap, and I, Jonas Miller, would be the spark. The evening after the meeting, the house sat in heavy silence. The dim yellow light cast down on the dinner table, but none of us touched the food. Elijah sat with his head down, eyes fixed on a bowl of cold rice. I knew he didn't want to ask, but eventually, the weight of fusion and buried pain pushed out the question I wasn't ready to answer. "Dad, why do they hate us?" His voice was hoarse, but his eyes glowed in the darkness, searching for an explanation. I couldn't speak. My chopsticks slipped from my fingers and hit the table with a hollow clatter. How could I explain to my 14-year-old son that their hatred had nothing to do with what we did, and everything to do with how they saw our skin, our roots, and the old pen that had stood longer than those luxury villas ever had? Placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremble in his narrow frame. "Because we're different, Elijah. We don't fit into the pretty picture they want to protect." His eyes started to fill. I knew that answer wouldn't ease his hurt. It would only teach him that we were being pushed out not for our flaws, but because we didn't match the image the HOA wanted to preserve. Elijah turned away, trying to swallow the tears. I wanted to hold him, to offer comfort, but all I had left to give was bitter silence. The next day, as I was still clearing the last broken boards from the destroyed pen, a sleek car pulled up in front of the house. Claudine Harrow stepped out, her heels striking the concrete like hammer blows against my chest. She held a new stack of fines, face blank and detached. Elijah came out to stand beside me, his gaze burning with restrained anger. Claudine pinned the paper to our door right in front of us, every motion slow and deliberate, as if to stretch the humiliation. Her voice rang out, each word sharp and bitter. Teach your son not to dirty our lake. I don't want your blood and sweat polluting the scenery anymore. I stood frozen. Elijah bit down on his lip until it bled, fist clenched tight. I could see him holding himself back. Claudine looked at us like we were insects beneath her feet, then turned and walked away, calm and indifferent. She didn't need to scream. Just a few cruel words were enough to drive the blade. Elijah quickly pulled out his phone, recording Claudine as she posted the fine and hurled those insults. He slipped it into his pocket without a word, but I saw the flash in his eye. It wasn't fear, it was the first spark of defiance. I pulled him inside and tried to soothe him. Don't let her words hurt you. But Elijah looked me straight in the eye, his voice firm. Dad, she's not just trying to hurt me. She's trying to crush us. But I won't let her turn me into someone who stays silent. That sentence caught in my throat. I realized my son had grown up pain, and that pain was turning into resolve. I couldn't bring myself to encourage him to stand against Claudine, but I also couldn't put out the fire inside him. In my mind, Claudine's words still echoed, each one biting like an indictment, not of me, but of herself. That evening, Elijah locked his bedroom door while I stayed at the table, staring at the stack of violation notices. Each sheet felt like a blade, aimed not just at me, but at a child still growing, still learning how to see the world. Claudine wanted to turn me into a joke, but in doing so, she had exposed cruelty to a child, and in that moment, she made a mistake. When Elijah opened his door, he stepped out with his phone in hand, the screen glowing. He handed it to me. The video showed Claudine, clear in both her gaze and her voice, the way she slapped the notice onto the door like she was issuing a decree. Hearing her say, "Teach your son not to dirty our lake," made my blood boil. Elijah looked me in the eye and said firmly, "I recorded everything. This isn't just an insult. It's evident. She wants us to feel ashamed, but she's the one who's going to bow her head." I sat quietly for a moment, then placed my hand on his shoulder and gave it a light squeeze. In his eyes, I saw a younger version of myself, back when I still believed justice could overcome power. In that moment, I knew I was no longer fighting alone. Claudine had planted the wound, but in doing so, she had handed us the weapon we needed to strike back. Night fell. I watched my son sleep, his face still carrying traces of defiance from the long day. I made a silent promise that tonight's pain would become the fire lighting our path forward. Claudine wanted to shame my family, but in doing so, she created a piece of evidence the entire community would have to reckon with. She didn't realize that the words she thought harmless insults would become the very blade she drove into her own authority. And I, Jonas Miller, would be the one to hold that blade until the day she falls. Just a few days after Claudine stood in front of me to post yet another violation notice, the wave of absurdity began crashing down. I had barely taken one paper off the door before a new one appeared the next day. They claimed the color of my gate paint didn't match the landscape, even though it had been approved when I first moved in. They wrote that the flower pots on my porch were not proportionate, demanding a full replacement. They even measured the fence height and fined me for it being a few centimeters too tall, despite the fact that the HOA itself had approved the blue. Each notice was a stat. Claudine didn't need to say much. She let the numbers and petty lines of print speak for her contempt. It was clear her goal wasn't order, and it definitely wasn't aesthetic. She wanted to make my family a constant target, wearing us down until we surrendered. I copied every violation notice, numbering them by date. Every line I wrote became a tally of abuse, a record for the battle I now knew I would have to fight. The more I read them, the more blatant Claudine's shamelessness became. She had turned regulations into weapons for personal revenge, while the residents stayed silent, heads bowed, afraid that tomorrow it might be their turn. One morning, as I stood in the yard, Claudine arrived with 2 board members. She didn't bother with greetings, just glanced at my house like it was a stain. Her voice rang out, cold and bare of pretense. "Farmers belong on farms. Don't drag your dirt into places like this. Lakeshore isn't for people like you." I clenched my jaw, fists tightening. Rage surged through me, but I held it in. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. I just stood there, eyes locked on her face. Claudine glanced back at me, a half smile curling up, then turned and walked away, leaving behind the stench of disdain. As their car pulled off, a neighbor from the same row walked over, his voice low enough only for me to hear. He hesitated, eyes scanning the street before speaking. "They want you to settle sell cheap, then they'll swoop in. They've done it to others before. I turned to him, feeling both gratitude and a deeper bitterness. I understood then. Claudine wasn't just trying to harass me. She was cornering me, pushing me to despair so I'd give up and sell the house. And when that happened, the real estate companies backing her would pounce, buy it for a bargain, flip it for profit. That night I sat at the table, laying out the entire stack of notices. Elijah sat beside me, staring at each paper with burning eye. He said softly, "They don't want us here." I nodded, but instead of letting the anger swallow me, I channeled it into focus. Look closely. These aren't our failures. They're evident, and evidence doesn't lie. Elijah didn't speak, but I saw a new light in his eye, a steady resolve beginning to take shape. I knew Claudine thought this relentless harassment would break, but she was wrong. She didn't know I'd lived through harder days, endured losses far greater than property. These violations only made me stronger, more driven to strike back. The next day, I saw Claudine standing with a few lakeside residents. They laughed, raised their wine glasses, and occasionally glanced in my direction. Claudine made sure I could hear her, her voice sweet, every word laced venom. "We have to maintain standard. Can't let someone drag in cattle pens and country habits to taint the image of this resort lake." A round of laugh burst out, sharp as knives stabbing into my back. I turned away, but I etched every word deep into my mind. I didn't respond, not then. I knew Claudine wanted me to lose my composure, to give her more fuel, but I wouldn't hand her that satisfaction. I would let my silence become the sharp blade, waiting for the moment to cut through her mask. I returned home and wrote a few more lines in the notebook that had thickened by the day. The pages were filled with Claudine's venom, a record of her abuse of power. I knew that when the time came, all of it would turn against her. Claudine thought she held control, but she didn't realize that her own arrogance was building the very stick I would use to strike her down. Night fell, and the house was silent, broken only by the hum of insects outside the window. I watched my son sleep, his face still tense from the pressure the HOA had placed. I made a quiet promise. This campaign of harassment would not break us. It would do the opposite. It would become the catalyst, turning us into fighters stronger than ever before. And Claudine, through her own cruelty, had unknowingly handed me the match to burn down her false throne. That night, the lights from the lakeside villas lit up the water, shimmering like the entire community had dressed itself in luxury. Music echoed from the lawn by the lake, where Claudine was hosting a grand party for the residents. Long tables were covered in white cloth, glasses of red wine sparkled under the lights, and laughter rang out as if injustice and pain had never existed here. I stood at the edge of the crowd, uninvited but present, because I knew Claudine would use this moment to do what she did best, turn me into a public punchline to strengthen her grip on power. Elijah told me not to go, but I refused to hide. I needed to witness how Claudine staged her performance, to remember every detail. Claudine appeared like a queen, wine glass raised, her radiant smile polished by the chandelier's glow. She tapped the glass against the microphone, silencing the conversation. The crowd turned toward her, waiting. Her voice rose, clear and theatrical. "Dear friends, tonight we gather by the lake to toast to Lakeshore, a community where value and class are preserved by the efforts of us all. But one among us has failed to respect that. Someone has dragged down the reputation of our community, tarnished the image of beautiful resort lake. That person is Jonas Miller." Her finger pointed straight at me, as if to permanently mark me as the outsider in this curated circle of elegance. The crowd erupted in quickly turning into stifled chuckles. Some covered their mouths, but the glee was obvious. I felt my feet rooted to the ground, my whole body pushed out of place, as if none of the light from this party had ever been meant for me. Claudine continued, her voice sweet but laced with poison. "Just imagine, among these grand homes, beside this shimmering lake, filthy, crumbling pen. Does it belong in this picture? Number. Lakeshore must remain a place people who understand value, who live by standard, and we will not let anyone ruin that." Applause broke out, mingled with mocking laughter. A few guests lifted their glasses to Claudine, as if to toast her triumph. I stood still, letting the humiliation wash over me, but I did not fall. I did not lower my gaze. I looked Claudine straight in the eye, letting her see that I was still standing. My voice cut through, sharp and simple. "That lake you keep bragging about, it might not be yours forever." The air froze for a few seconds. Some laughed louder, thinking I was delusional. Claudine smirked, lifted her glass for a sip, and cast a dismissive glance my way like she was watching someone make a fool of himself. She didn't respond, because she believed I had nothing to fight with, angry words. But right then, from the back row, a raspy voice broke through the illusion of agreement. An elderly resident, someone who had lived in Lakeshore since the early days, blurted out, "She acts like the lake belongs to her." The entire crowd froze. The laughter died instantly. Claudine spun around, her eyes sharp as blades, searching for the one who dared say it. The old man was too far past caring about threatening stares. He simply sat there, lifted his glass, and drank, eyes fixed on the dark water as if something long hidden has been laid bare. Claudine forced a smile, trying to regain control, her voice rising to drown it out. "Let's not let a few nonsense words spoil the spirit of the evening. This party is to celebrate our values, not to entertain off-key opinions." But I saw it. Crack had just formed in the wall of power she had spent years building. Some people glanced at one another, others avoided her gaze. The applause that followed was scattered, no longer thunderous. I quietly turned and walked away from the party. I knew I had been made the butt of their laughter, but I also knew one thing for certain. The truth had spoken, and it had found its way in through a flaw. Claudine could keep smiling, keep pretending she held all the power, but she could no longer hide the fact that the lake was not hers alone, and her rule was no longer absolute. On the walk home, Elijah walked beside me, his hand gripping mine tightly. He didn't say a word, but that grip told me everything. He had seen it all, heard both the humiliation and the moment when truth slipped through. I knew that from tonight on, we were no longer alone. In my chest, the shame of that party simmered into a quiet flame. Claudine had tried to cast me out, but in doing so, she exposed her own arrogance to the entire community. And when a wall begins to crack, it only takes one good strike to bring it down. I swore I would be the one to strike it. I knew Claudine believed she had won after the lake party. She stood there, wine glass raised, surrounded by a crowd echoing her mocking laugh. But what she didn't know was that Elijah and I had kept a weapon she couldn't control, the video showing her hurling insults at us in front of our home, taping that citation to our door while spewing the cruelest word. That night, I sat with Elijah and replayed the footage. On screen, Claudine's voice rang out, cold and precise. "Teach your son not to dirty our lake." Her hand slammed the citation onto the door, her smirk sharp and unmistakable. Elijah looked at me with unwavering eyes. He didn't need to say anything. I already knew what he wanted me to do. I posted the video to social media just before dawn with no caption beyond a single line. "This is how the HOA treats a family in this community." I didn't expect much, but deep down, I held on to a quiet hope that the truth would find its way forward. By morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Within hours, the video had tens of thousands of views and hundreds of comments. The hashtag HOAABUSE began to spread, followed by hashtag farmers' right. People shared the clip with outrage, not only at the destroyed pens, but at Claudine's tone, so blatant, so discriminatory, so self-righteous in deciding who was worthy of belonging here. Local media moved fast. Within 2 days, reporters were at my gate, microphones out, cameras pointed at my face. I told the story exactly as it happened, leaving the video to do the proving. Elijah stood beside me, his face glowing with pride because he had been the one to capture it. The story didn't stay low. Larger outlets picked it up, highlighting the angle of discrimination. Headlines like "Farming Family Humiliated and Targeted by HOA" spread like wildfire, igniting public outrage. All eyes were now on Claudine and the HOA board. Claudine, of course, didn't sit quiet. She rushed onto television, her face tight, but her fake smile still intact. Her voice rang out as if she could wipe everything clean. That was edited content. The video was deliberately manipulated to defame me and the board. I laughed as I heard it on TV, because in the video, everything was too clear. No one could deny the voice, the look in her eyes, or the contempt she wore so openly. Viewers didn't need me to explain. It was all there for them to see. What Claudine didn't expect was that her denial only fueled the fire. Social media exploded with comments. "If that was edited, explain why you said those words. No one can fake that look of disdain. This isn't just a video. It's a raw attitude." In the middle of the storm, something unexpected happened. A strange message appeared in my inbox. Its content was just one line. "I used to work for the HOA. This is the truth." Attached was a single file. I opened it and my heart pounded faster with every word as I read the internal HOA email. The sender remained anonymous, but the document was real. In the email, the directive was plain as day. "Get that colored family off the lake by any means. If needed, use violations as a tool. They don't match our standard." I sat still for a long time. This wasn't suspicion anymore, or rumor. This was a command in writing, sent through the HOA's internal system, living proof that Claudine and her allies had deliberately targeted my family for our skin color and background. I printed every page, clipped them neatly, and laid them out on the table in front of Elijah. He read each line, his eyes wide with fury. "Dad, she just tied the noose around her own neck. This is the truth she can't deny." I nodded, a cold resolve rising in me. Claudine once believed that absurd fines and public humiliation could push me out of Lakeshore, but now, that same arrogance had created the biggest crack in her power. The next day, I sent copies of the emails to the news outlet that had interviewed me. Within hours, headlines appeared everywhere. Internal emails reveal HOA's racial discrimination. The video had already shocked people, but now there were official documents. The public erupted. Outrage spread like wildfire through dry field. Claudine was forced back onto television. This time, her face no longer wore false confidence. Sweat glistened. Her voice stumbled. This was the act of an individual, and does not reflect the views of the board. But no one believed her. Claudine's name was right there in the email thread, the one issuing the command. Lakeshore residents began to speak openly. In the supermarket, I overheard whispers. "If she did that to Jonas, tomorrow it could be us." Some avoided my eyes, but no one laughed anymore. A few nodded to me quiet, an unspoken acknowledgement. I knew the battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. I was no longer the lone voice against Claudine. The community, and even the outside world, was watching now. Claudine had exposed herself before everyone, and she would never escape the shadow of that truth. That night, I sat with Elijah, flipping through newspapers, reading the waves of public support. My son smiled for the first time in months, not fully, but with hope. "Dad, we're not fighting alone anymore." I placed a hand on his shoulder and answered slowly, "That's right, Elijah. This is only the beginning." Fire in me had fully ignited, no longer just because our pens were destroyed, but for the dignity of my family, for justice for everyone who had been crushed by the HOA. Claudine once thought she was the law, but now the real law was coming for her, and this time there would be no way out. After the video and internal emails spread everywhere, the atmosphere in Lakeshore shifted noticeably. Every time I stepped outside, I no longer faced only contemptuous stares. Instead came hesitation, conflict. Some people avoided looking directly at me, but they whispered to each other as I walked past. I caught fragments of conversation drifting from porch, from the grocery store, from those walks around the lake where I was once treated like an outsider. "If they did that to Jonas, tomorrow it could be us," a middle-aged woman murmured to her neighbor as I happened to pass by. Her voice trembled, not from hatred, from fear. That single sentence spread like wind, reaching others, planting unease. For the first time, the community began to question the supposed absoluteness of Claudine Harrow's authority. I didn't fool myself into thinking everyone would suddenly take my side. Claudine had ruled too long, fear she had sown too deep. But when the truth is laid bare, fear begins to turn into doubt. And once doubt enters, authoritarian power starts to wobble. At the next emergency HOA meeting, Claudine entered still cloaked in arrogance, but her eyes shifted faster than usual. I saw her scanning every face in the room, searching for the traitor. The emails had shown her there were cracks inside the board itself. Loyalty was no longer guaranteed. Claudine slammed her hand on the table, her voice rising in fury, cutting through the murmurs. "Anyone who sides with him is betraying this entire neighborhood. I will not allow one person to infect Lakeshore with rebellion. He's just a farmer, an outsider, unworthy of being compared to a community of this caliber." This time there was no applause, only heavy silence. People looked around, avoiding each other's eyes. A few residents stared at their note, pretending to write, but their hands were trembling. Claudine tried to assert dominance, but the more she shouted, the more her panic showed. Then something unprecedented happened. A young family sitting near the corner of the room stood up. The husband, tall and lean, his eyes bright with conviction, held his wife's hand and their small child, and said loudly, "We disagree. What Jonas went through was wrong. No one deserves to be treated that way. We can't call this a community if actions like that are tolerated." The room froze. No one expected someone to confront Claudine so openly. The woman beside him nodded and squeezed their child's hand. The little one looked around, wide-eyed, but I saw the pride reflected in both parents' faces. Claudine's face turned pale, but she quickly raised her voice again. "You dare go against me? You don't know what you're saying. Lakeshore is what it is today because of my leadership. Without me, your property values will collapse. Do you want to lose everything?" But no one laughed or echoed her anymore. Instead, a suffocating silence settled over the room. Eyes began to shift. I saw a few people turn to look at me, not with contempt time, but with consideration, hesitation. They were beginning to ask themselves, if Claudine truly acted for the good of the community, why would she be so afraid of a truth exposed? I stood up, my voice calm but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I didn't come here to drag anyone down. I only want fairness. Claudine says I've hurt property values, but but it's her use of power like a whip that's tearing this community apart. She's forgotten that real value isn't in the lake or the villa. It's in the people who live here. Someone cleared their throat. Another nodded discreetly. Few hesitant glances turned more certain. The once absolute faith in Claudine was visibly cracking. She looked around the room, her eyes flashing with fury at what she saw, but there was no shouting loud enough to fill the widening gaps in the crowd's trust. When the meeting ended, the room emptied quietly. People left without the usual buzz of gossip and chatter. I stood by the door, catching fragments of whispers as they passed. Maybe we've kept our eyes closed too long. She can't hide the truth forever. Small as they were, those words felt like the first fractures in the fort Claudine had built around herself. Elijah came to my side, his eyes glowing. He whispered, "Dad, they're starting to see it. She doesn't scare them anymore." I placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling hope rise again in my chest. Claudine might still hold power, but it had lost its grip. And once the community's trust begins to crack, there's no patching it together. I turned to look at the shimmering lake, where small boats were docked and lights danced across the surface. On the outside, everything still looked pristine, but beneath it, the undercurrents were and I knew those waves would soon rise, and they would tear the throne Claudine had sat on for far too long right out from under her. The hall was packed that day, not just with residents obligated to attend, but with curious onlookers who came to see what Claudine Harrow would pull next. I sat in the last row, calmly flipping through my notebook, though inside, fire raged. Every citation, every insult, every clip of video, and now the internal email. They were all ready to be placed on the scale. Claudine might think she still held power, but I knew today was the day she'd start to lose it. When the gavel struck to begin, Claudine rose and stepped into the center of the room with the posture of someone who had never known defeat. She smiled, the same false smile everyone had seen before, but her eyes darted around the room as if trying to control every stare. Then she launched into her familiar speech, repeating the same words about values and standards. Lakeshore can only thrive if we keep it clean, and those who disrupt that balance, who drag us down, cannot be considered part of this community. I listened to every word like it was a slap, not just to me, but to every resident she had ever silenced. I stood, my voice slicing through the room. "You're not a queen here, Claudine. This is a community, not your personal kingdom." The room fell silent. A few people turned to look at me. Others covered their mouths, unsure what would come next. Claudine froze for a moment, then shouted, her voice trembling with rage. "I've kept that lake clean from filth like you. Without me, it would be filled with mud and trash." The word filth dropped like an axe, slicing through the air. The residents of color in the room went still, their fists clenched, their eyes shifting from fear, fury. Claudine had finally said out loud what she had long denied, the contempt and discrimination at her core. I pulled a stack of papers from my bag and stepped forward. My voice lowered but echoed, "If you truly care only about cleanliness, then why send this email?" I raised the printed internal email, the black text bold and undeniable. I read aloud, pressing each word. "Get that colored family off the lake by any means. If needed, use violations as a tool. They don't match our standards." The room erupted. Whispers burst into noise. Several residents stood up, their faces changing as if waking from a spell. Someone shouted from the middle row, "It's her! We've been fooled for too long." A group of residents stormed out mid-meeting. Chairs scraped harshly against the floor. One man shouted as he walked out the door, "We don't need a dictator anymore." Claudine went pale but tried to recover, stammering, This is fabricated. He made it up to smear me." But her eyes darted wildly, and her voice lacked firmness she was known for. She could dismiss a video as edited, but how could she deny a chain of internal emails complete with digital signatures? I looked straight at the crowd, ignoring Claudine, and spoke loud enough for every person to hear. "You've heard her call me and others filth. You've seen her destroy my livestock pen, humiliate my son, and now you've read the very words she sent. This is no longer just about me. It's about how she treats anyone she deems unworthy. Today, it's me. Tomorrow, it could be your family." A wave of noise rippled through the room, but it was no longer laughter. I saw the change in people's eyes. Doubt had turned to anger, silence to voice. A middle-aged woman shouted from the corner of the room, "We've been silent for too long. She doesn't deserve this anymore." Claudine tried to scream over the uproar to regain control, but her voice was drowned in the chaos. I stepped back and sat down, taking a deep breath. I knew I had done what needed to be done. It was no longer just about me. The truth had been placed in front of the entire community, and once the speak, no power can silence. Elijah sat beside me, his eyes shining. He whispered, "Dad, they're seeing it now. She can't scare them anymore." I gripped my son's hand tightly, knowing the fight far from over, but also knowing we had crossed a turning point. Claudine had just lost the one thing she valued most, complete trust from her community. The meeting ended in chaos. Half the residents walked out. The rest clustered in group, talking in heated tones. Claudine was left standing alone in the middle of the room, her face pale, her hand trembling as she clutched the microphone. Though still on her feet, she no longer held the reins. I walked out of the hall with my head held high. The road ahead was still rough, but I wasn't alone anymore. The fracture had begun, and from those small cracks, the wall of Claudine's power would soon come crashing down. Within a single night, news of the chaotic meeting spread across headlines. Bold titles filled the front pages. HOA accused of racism, forced property destruction. Beneath them was a photo of my flattened pen, along with a quote from the internal email I had released. The media no longer stayed neutral. They named Claudine Harrow directly, calling her a ruler who governed through fear and discrimination. I sat in our small home, flipping through each page. Elijah sat beside me, his eyes lighting up with every new line he read. He asked, "Dad, now everyone knows, right?" I nodded, but didn't feel relief. I knew that when the truth came out, Claudine wouldn't stay quiet. She had grown used to absolute power, and once it started to slip, she would claw at anything to hold on. Just as I expected, that afternoon, Claudine appeared on live television. She still wore her signature light-colored suit, as if trying to project the image of control, but her face was flushed and tight. The host asked a simple question: "Do you deny sending the email under your name that calls for the removal of a family of color from the community?" Claudine inhaled sharply, trying to smile, but her voice wavered. I believe that the email was doctored. I never gave such an order. This is slander, a coordinated attempt to damage my reputation and that of Lake. That denial immediately ignited another wave of outrage. On the screen, live comments flooded the chat. "Doctored? What about the digital signature? We heard her call them filth with our own ears. Does she think we're all blind?" The more Claudine spoke, the more obvious her panic and dishonesty became. I looked at Elijah, saw him clenching his fist. His voice was firm, filled with anger. "She looked straight into the camera and lied, but now everyone sees through it." The next day, I went to the market. The atmosphere around the lake was completely different from before. Some people still avoided me, but many looked at me with changed expressions. One woman approached gently and said, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." She kept us scared for too long. I nodded without resentment. I understood. Fear had always been Claudine's strongest weapon. But now, with the curtain falling, courage was beginning to return. That evening, I received a message from a young journalist. "Mr. Jonas, the public is waiting for you to speak again. They want to hear it from you, not just through clip." I read the message and felt the pressure growing. I was no longer just speaking for myself. I now stood for everyone who had been silenced by the HOA. Elijah sat across from me, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Dad, we have to speak. If you stay quiet, they'll think we're still afraid. Let them see what she did to us." I was silent for a moment, then nodded. I knew the time had come to turn the truth into a public voice, one loud enough that Claudine could never walk away from it. As night fell, I wrote out what needed to be said, each sentence steady and deliberate. I didn't intend to plead for pity. I wanted the world to see Claudine's arrogance, to witness a community ruled by contempt and greed. The weight of public pressure was no longer just on me. It was tightening around Claudine's neck now, and she would not be able to escape it. Broadcast footage showed Claudine sitting before the camera, face layered in makeup, couldn't hide her unease. I watched the live stream, not with anger or satisfaction, just calm as I muttered, "The truth can't be covered with a pale suit." Elijah sat beside me, his lips pressed tight, eyes glowing with quiet agreement. He understood that by now, we no longer had to shout. The public had begun speaking for us. Within a single evening, social media exploded with posts and comments. Someone shared a photo of me in the video, captioned, "This is what a real lakeshore resident looks like." Others posted images of Claudine with the words, "Her law is built on disdain." Hashtags about justice and discrimination spread from small towns to national forum. I read through every comment, realizing the wave of anger had grown far beyond our little neighborhood. The press kept covering the story, but no longer from a neutral stand. One editorial read, "If a woman can sit in front of a camera and deny undeniable evidence, then that community has been led by lies for far too long." The real question, how many other families have suffered in silence? I knew those words had struck a nerve, not just in Lakeshore, but with anyone who had ever lived under quiet oppression. Claudine, of course, didn't stay silent. She sent emails to every household, trying to claim she was being slandered. But instead of earning sympathy, residents passed those messages around like trophies of her desperation. A few families whispered to me in passing on the street, "We used to believe in her, but not anymore." Their voices were low, but their eyes were certain. Elijah walked beside me, faint smile on his lip. My son, who once asked why people hated us, was now witnessing a different answer. No No longer hate, recognition of the truth. Dad, they don't look at us like outsiders anymore, he whispered. I nodded, knowing trust was shift, and when trust shifts, old power structures crumble. Public outrage swelled, growing louder each day like a rising tide. Reporters showed up at my gate, microphones out, asking, Mr. Jonas, what do you want from all this? I answered simply, I want not just for my family, but for everyone who's ever been treated like less. My words were published in full. Instantly became the most shared quote of the week. Claudine tried to strike back, accusing me of chasing fame, claiming I was exploiting sympathy to bring down the HOA, but her accusations fell flat. The footage, the emails, the tone in her own voice, none of it could be erased. And now, the people no longer believed her. That night, as I sat on the porch and the wind from the lake carried a chill through the air, I heard the murmurs of people walking by, still talking about the event. A man spoke loudly. We've been blindfolded too long. Enough is enough. His voice echoed in the darkness, but it was strong enough. Anyone who heard it feel the wall of Claudine's power starting to crack. Elijah came out and sat beside me, his eyes fixed on the shimmering lights reflected on the lake. He asked, do you think people are on our side now? I smiled faintly and replied, once the truth is out, even if they're slow, they'll have to choose eventually. And Claudine has no more lies left to hide behind. I knew this storm of public backlash was only just beginning, but it was already strong enough to shove Claudine out of her comfort zone. From now on, every word she spoke would be scrutinized, every step she questioned, and for the first time in months of humiliation, felt the scales of justice beginning to tilt in my favor. I sat in the quiet of my house while outside, the murmurs of conversation still echoed across the neighborhood. The weight of public scrutiny had cornered Claudine, but I knew she wouldn't stop. She would cling to power, to excuses, to whatever she could use to humiliate and crush. I looked out at the lake shimmering under the light, once again struck by the bitter disparity. On one side, brightly lit mansion, and on the other, my small home, bearing the brunt of contempt day after day. In that moment, a memory came rushing back. The resort lake Claudine always flaunted, the one she claimed was the soul of the community, only existed because of the water flow from the old dam on my family's land. The dam had been built by my grandfather to serve the farm and the surrounding land. When the development was built, they skirted the law to tap into that source, but the deed still bore the Miller name. The dam valve was still under my control. It was the one thing the HOA had never touched, because they assumed I wouldn't dare, that I would always bow and endure. For years, I never once thought about turning it. To me, that water was life itself, the memory of 3 generations of Millers. But now, staring at the wreckage of my barn, remembering the laughter at my expense, the contempt in Claudine's eyes as shamed my son, something inside me hardened. I stood up and stepped into the night. The wind from the lake was cool against my face, but in my chest burned a fire I couldn't put out. I walked the path toward the dam, every step firm. Elijah called after me, his voice edged with worry. But I only turned and said softly, it's time they learn who they underestimated. The path to the dam was so familiar, I could have walked it with my eyes closed. But tonight, each step landed heavier than usual. I saw my father standing there years ago, hand on the valve key, telling me, this water is life. Protect it. I'd nodded then, carrying that promise all my life. But if my father were here, he'd understand that sometimes life only survives when you use it to defend your dignity. I placed my hand on the large iron wheel. The metal had dulled with time, but it was still strong. In that moment, memories surged, the lowing of cattle, Elijah's laughter echoing through the yard, the roar of bulldozers tearing it all down. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and turned. The sound of rushing water erupt, thundering from the belly of the dam, roaring like a beast long held in chains. I turned again, feeling the flow. Water surged down the old irrigation channel, leaving the resort lake behind. In the dark, I heard shouting. Claudine appeared with a few HOA board members, flashlights cutting through the night toward me. Her voice cracked with panic. Jonas, you can't do this. You'll ruin the lake. I stood tall, my gaze cold and steady. My voice came out calm, measured, but heavy with resolve. You ruined my barn, destroyed my family's peace. This is justice. You always thought you were the law, Claudine, but the real law is flowing through my hands now. Claudine lunged toward me, but the others didn't dare follow. They knew full well this dam valve was legally mine, that I had the right to control it. The roar of water surging below drowned out any protest. Claudine screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the fury of the current, rendered meaningless. I stood still, hand resting on the iron wheel, no longer trembling. I didn't didn't do this out of blind revenge, but because she forced me to prove that no one can trample my family and expect to stand unchallenged. Claudine's eyes darkened as she stumbled back, her face contorted in helpless rage. I turned away, leaving behind her frantic screams, walking into the night with one unshakable belief. I hadn't just turned a valve, I'd shifted the balance of power in Lake. Darkness blanketed the dam with only the sounds of insects and wind weaving through the trees. I stood before the valve, hand clenched tight, every muscle taut with anger and resolve. In my mind, I saw the barn crushed to rubble, heard Claudine's mocking laughter, saw the hurt in Elijah's eyes, all of it pushing me to the edge. I turned the wheel hard. The metal groaned, heavy but certain. Within seconds, a deep rumble echoed from the dam's core as water thundered out like a beast breaking its chain. I stepped back, watching the stream shift course, no longer feeding the resort lake but surging into the old canal that led to the field. The sound roared like a declaration, echoing into the night. Footsteps rushed behind me, flashlights scattering beams across the dark. Claudine emerged with several HOA board members, her face flushed under the flickering light, eyes wide with panic. She shrieked, her voice slicing through the roar of water. "You wouldn't dare! Jonas, you're destroying everything." I didn't flinch, didn't blink. I looked straight into her fear-stricken eyes. My voice rang out, steady, firm. "I'm only doing what you did to my barn." The air tight, stretched to the breaking point. Claudine lunged again, but stopped cold as she realized every argument she had ever clung to no longer applied. The dam sat on my family's land. The valve was under my control. There wasn't a single clause in the HOA charter that could strip that truth away, and that truth made her tremble with fury. One of the board members muttered, voice unsteady, "What do we do now?" The lake's actually draining. Claudine turned, eyes blazing, but she had no answer. All she could do was repeat, like someone drowning, "Jonas, you'll pay for this. I'll ruin you." I crossed my arms, eyes fixed on hers. "The only thing I'm paying for, Claudine, is staying silent too long. You destroyed my barn to keep your lake pristine. Now look at it. Look at what your lake is coming." The roar of water below rose like an exclamation mark to my word. Claudine looked out across the lake, where, under the cover of night, the waterline was visibly receding. Gentle waves lapped against shore, revealing patches of black mud rising from beneath. Face contorted, caught between fear and fury. Elijah came running from afar, breathless but eyes blazing. He had seen everything, and I could read both pride and awe in my son's gaze. Claudine looked at Elijah, then turned back to me, her voice catching, "You're destroying your son's future. When this lake dries up, we all lose." I lifted my chin, voice cold. "You're wrong. I'm not destroying my son's future. I'm taking it back. If the future has to be built on humiliation and oppression, then it deserves fall." The people with Claudine stayed silent, none daring to interrupt. They knew this moment could not be undone. The valve had turned, the water had changed course, and there was nothing Claudine could do to stop it. She stood frozen, her whole body rigid, then suddenly let out a scream, wild and unhinged. But the scream was hollow, powerless against the raging current spilling away from the lake. Claudine turned and staggered off, her light-colored suit stained and blotched in the darkness like a blemish that would never wash away. I stood there, Elijah beside me, both of us watching the lake slowly drain. There was no trembling left, only a cold calm. Deep down, I knew I had rewritten the rules of Lakeshore, not with fine, not with insult, but with the water that had belonged to my family for generations. That night, I walked away from the dam, my shoulders heavy, but my steps light. I knew that come morning, when sunlight poured over the lake, the entire community would see the price of arrogance. Claudine thought she was untouchable, but with one turn of the valve, everything changed. And for me, it wasn't just retribution, it was the beginning of true justice. The next morning, as the first sunlight hit the lake, the entire community was stunned. The water had almost completely receded, revealing a cracked stretch of mud. Logs once kissed by waves now lie exposed, blackened and rotting. Dead fish littered the mudflat, their stench overpowering the scent of flowers from the lakeside garden. In a single night, Lakeshore's proudest symbol had turned into a pathetic swamp. I stood at the lake's edge, gazing at the scene with a cold stare. No one could hear the gentle sound of water or see the mirror-like shimmer anymore. Only the panicked cries of a few residents remained, the rush of footsteps as people ran to their porches to witness the brutal truth. A woman clutched her face and cried, "God, our house just lost all its value." Another blurted, "What's the point of a lakeside villa without a lake?" Families who once mocked me now looked at each other, their faces drained of color. They had spent hundreds of thousands, even millions, to buy a home with the promise of a lake view every every morning. Now all they saw was black mud and the smell of decay. Everything Claudine once used to elevate the community's value come crashing down, striking her and her loyalists in one crushing blow. Claudine appeared, face pale, her steps frantic. The light-colored suit that once cloaked her authority was now streaked with mud. She shouted, her voice cracking with panic. "Someone call security! Someone stop him! This is a crime. He's destroyed our lake." But no one answered. The residents who once cheered her now stood silent, some turning away, others watching with thinly veiled resentment. They knew who was truly to blame. The truth about the emails, the cruelty toward my family, it was all out in the open. Claudine tried to point the knife at me, but now she swung at empty air. I stepped closer, locking eyes with her twisted face, tight with rage. "Claudine, this isn't a crime. It's a reflection. You destroyed my barn to keep your lake pristine. Now your lake has been exposed, filthier than any barn could ever be." My words stirred the crowd. A man spoke up, voice trembling with fury. "How long have we been deceived by her? She said she was protecting the community, but she was just protecting her wallet and her pride." Claudine turned, grasping for control. "Don't believe him. He's out for revenge. He wants to bring us all down. Don't you see? He's nothing but a saboteur." But this time, no applause followed. A resident who had remained silent for years finally spoke. "If it weren't for Mr. Jonas, we'd never have seen her true face." That statement ignited something. Heads nodded, and eyes shifted from doubt to resolve. I looked at the drying lake, feeling the shift in the air. The lakeside mansions were now just blocks of concrete set in mud, their value drained away with the water. Residents whispered among themselves, some already considering selling, others cursing Claudine to her face. Claudine stepped back, her eyes wide as she realized the support she once commanded had fractured. There were no more cheers, no more applause, only angry stares and direct accusation. She trembled, but still tried to hold her voice firm. "I won't let it end like, Jonas, you'll pay for this," I answered, my voice steady, no need to raise it. "The only value lost here isn't mine, it's yours. You sold out this community's trust, and now they're giving you exactly what you deserve." The crowd fell silent. Then a few claps broke the stillness, weak first, then growing stronger. Elijah stood beside me, his eyes lit up as if watching justice shape. I gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze and whispered, "This is only the beginning. The lake may be dry, but the truth still has more to surface." All of Lakeshore stood before a cracked bed of mud, the grand homes now no different from castles built on sand. Claudine trembled among them, grasping for the control that was slipping through her fingers, but it was far too late. Her arrogance had drained with the water, leaving behind a swamp no amount of pretense could hide. Claudine staggered toward the lake's edge, her shoes caked in mud, the once pristine suit that symbolized her authority now stained and filthy, a rotten shell of what it used to be. She collapsed, hands shaking, pressing into the cracked mud. Her voice came out in a desperate rasp. "You've destroyed everything. Jonas, you've killed our lake. You've buried this community." I stepped forward, my gaze cold. The residents around us remained silent. No one stepped in, no one spoke for her. They simply watched, bearing witness to the moment when someone who once ruled absolutely was brought low. I leaned in, voice solid and unyielding. "Justice has a price. You destroyed my barn, tried to ruin my family's dignity. Now you finally understand what loss feels." Claudine lifted her head, face contorted with fury. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Around her, the murmurs began. A middle-aged man said aloud, "All of this started with her. If it weren't for her greed and control, the lake wouldn't have ended up like this." A younger woman added, "Jonas warned us." She didn't listen. This is what arrogance brings. The accusations came freely now, without fear. The crowd's eyes turned fully on Claudine, no longer toward me. She struggled to her feet, tried brushing the mud from her clothes, only to smear it further. Claudine stumbled back, slipped again into the muck, and a few bitter laughs escaped from the crowd, not out of cruelty, from years of buried frustration. I turned back to face them all, my voice clear, carrying across the silent lake bed. This isn't destruction. It's a reminder that no one has the right to belittle others. When justice isn't delivered, fairness will find its own voice. No one disagreed. And in that silence, I heard agreement. I knew then, from the moment Claudine collapsed into the mud, that the throne she had long clung to, fallen, irreparably and without a chance of return. The air around the lake that day was thick. The stench of mud and dead fish hit every nose sharply, making people grimace. But that disgust quickly turned into outrage, aimed directly at Claudine Harrow. A middle-aged man, once a loyal supporter who applauded her at every meeting, now stood up and pointed straight at her. His voice clipped and forced. She dragged us into this disaster. We bought homes here to live by a lake, and now what's left but a rotting swamp. Voices immediately joined in, rising like waves. An elderly woman gripped her railing tightly, her voice trembling but resolute. I stayed silent when she taped violation notices to Jonas's door. I stayed silent when she insulted people in meetings. But today, seeing the lake like this, I won't stay silent anymore. That sentence struck like a match to dry kindling. Residents who had long endured silently, intimidated by the HOA's power, now began to rise. Another voice from a man with sweat glistening on his forehead shouted, "She used us, turned this lake into a tool for her power and her pocket. She claimed she was protecting the community. No, she was protecting her own seat." Claudine's face went pale, her eyes bloodshot as she turned from one face to the next, screaming, "Are you all blind?" She pointed straight at me, "is the saboteur. Jonas Miller destroyed this lake, not me." Backlash came instant. A younger man fired back, "No, you lit the fuse. Without your tyranny and greed, no one would be paying this price." Another voice chimed in, "You've made us a laughingstock across the country. Who's going to call this place a resort now?" I stayed silent, letting the crowd speak. I didn't need to say a word. Every voice raised was proof truth had finally slipped from Claudine's control. She thrashed in the crowd like someone drowning, clinging to worn-out lies, but no one reached out to save her. Elijah stood beside me, eyes gleaming. He whispered, "See, Dad?" Finally speaking up. I nodded, a weight settling in my chest. I knew this backlash wasn't only because the lake had drained, but because they finally saw how long they had stayed silent, allowing a single domineering woman to rule over them. A group of residents stepped forward, confronting Claudine directly. The man at the front declared loudly, "We're calling on the city council. This HOA no longer represents us. Starting today, we no longer recognize Claudine Harrow as president." The crowd exploded. Applause and cheers ripped through the air. Claudine backed away, face ghost white, hands trembling as if grasping for something to hold on to. She screamed one final time, her voice cracking, "You'll all regret this. I kept this place alive. He's only destroyed it." But no one listened anymore. They turned their backs and walked away. No one feared her now. I looked at the scene, not with triumph, not with satisfaction. All I saw was a community finally reclaiming its voice. Elijah gently squeezed my hand and whispered, "Dad, they've woken up." I nodded, my eyes fixed on the patchy, muddied lake bed. Claudine could keep screaming, but her voice was now drowned out by the very people who once worshipped, and I understood. This fight was no longer just mine. It had become Lakeshore. Claudine stood unsteadily among the crowd, face dazed yet still clinging to whatever scraps of power she had left. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her voice shrill, rasping from shouting, "Don't let him fool you. Jonas Miller is the one who ruined everything. He turned the valve. He's the reason the lake is bone dry. If your property values crash, if this community falls apart, blame him, not me." I didn't respond. I stood still, my gaze locked on hers. I knew this was the moment to let the truth speak for itself. These people weren't blind anymore. They had seen, heard, and lived through what Claudine had done. And as soon as she finished, the pushback came swiftly from every direction. A middle-aged resident stepped forward, his voice firm. "No, you can't blame Jonas. If you hadn't destroyed his family's barn, if you hadn't constantly humiliated them, none of this would have happened." He paused, pointing out at the muddy lake. "We bought homes here to live in peace, not to serve your pride." Another voice, this one from someone who'd always sat silently in the back of meetings, spoke up, trembling but clear. "Your HOA fined me 3 times for planting trees in the wrong place. I stayed quiet because I was afraid of being isolated. But today I'm done staying silent. You are the root of this entire mess." The accusations poured forth like a flood. A young woman stepped forward, cradling a child in her arm, her voice shaking with indignation. "You once told me that the sound of children playing near the lake disrupted the serenity of the resort. I had to take my son inside, hide his laugh. That's not community, that's oppression. And now you want to blame Jonas? You're reaping exactly what you sowed." Claudine spun around, her eyes wild, her voice stammering. "You've all been fooled. He fabricated everything. He just wants to bring me down." But before she could finish, an elderly man, the first homeowner in Lakeshore, stepped forward with a cane, cutting her off. I received those HOA emails from Jonas myself, and I read them with my own eyes. That wasn't fabrication. It was blatant discrimination. And you ask who the real liar is? Crowds stirred. The whispers were no longer cautious. They were bold and open. One by one, Residents recounted their own experiences with the HOA, unfair penalties, public shaming, instances where Claudine wielded her power to crush dissent. And piece by piece, full picture formed, not of me as the villain, but of Claudine and the regime she had run, the very force responsible for the disaster now staring them all in the face. I looked around and saw the faces that once turned away, now turning back, rising in unison. Their strength no longer lay in fearful silence, but in their collective voice. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to defend myself. The community had spoken on my behalf. Claudine screamed one final time, her voice cracked and frayed. "You've all betrayed me, kept this place alive. Without me, Lakeshore would be nothing." But her cries were swallowed by a rising wave of defiance. People shouted back, "No, without you, Lakeshore can finally breathe." I stood quietly, listening to every word, witnessing a simple truth. Claudine had lost the only thing that ever kept her in power, submission. And once submission turned to resistance, her authority crumbled completely. In the days following the upheaval, public outrage didn't subside. It surged higher. News of the drained lake, the internal emails, and the residents' uprising spread across the city. Media pressure forced the authorities to act. One morning, I received an official document. The city was launching a full investigation into the HOA and Claudine Harrow, focusing on the legality of water management and lake ownership. I brought the letter out to the porch. Elijah skimmed it, then looked up, eyes bright. "Dad, they're finally stepping in." I nodded, a feeling rising in my chest, a mixture of relief and tension. I knew we were on the right path, but I also knew Claudine wouldn't go down quietly. A few days later, city officials arrived on site. They came with legal advisors, water resource engineers, and even security personnel to maintain order. I led them to the old dam, where the water still surged toward the farmlands as it once had. I presented documents our family had preserved for decades, the legal rights to extract and manage the water source, stamped with the red seal of the county court from back then. One of the officials flipped through each page, nodding before turning to a colleague. "There's no doubt about it. The resort lake was formed from this water source, and the rights were never transferred. Jonas Miller has legal authority." The statement landed like a gavel. I watched Claudine's face go rigid, her eyes wide. She tried to cut in, voice proud but trembling. "Can't be right. This lake is the heart of the community. The HOA has managed for years. We have the authority to decide all related activity." The official looked up and responded quickly, "You may govern its use, but the water rights were never granted to the HOA. It's clearly outlined in the record." Claudine froze, speechless. A legal truth she never saw coming had just been laid bare. She had built her entire authority on a foundation that wasn't hers. Around us, the residents stirred. Some exchanged looks, and someone scoffed. So, all this time, she's been borrowing power from something she never owned. I looked at Claudine and said nothing. There was nothing more to add. Reality had spoken for itself. A cold calm rose in me. I had waited for this moment for so long. The moment the self-claimed law was silenced by the actual law. Elijah gripped my hand tightly and whispered, "Dad, she's got nowhere left to run." I leaned down and nodded to my son, then looked around at the residents' faces, now lit with a new kind of certainty. The government had spoken, and Claudine's falsehoods had nowhere left to hide. The investigation wrapped up, and the officials collected their document, promising a formal conclusion soon. For me, today's confirmation was enough. I stepped away from the dam, aware of the eyes following me, full of gratitude, encouragement, and above all, awakening. They had finally seen with their own eyes that the person who stood above them never truly held the power she claimed. Claudine stood frozen, her lips trembling, face drained of all color. She no longer shouted, no longer offered any defense. All that remained was a hesitance, the collapse of a mask that had been worn far too long. The air in the city hall was tense to the point where a single breath could make everyone feel the shift in temperature. Thick folders of land ownership, water rights, and the history of the dam were laid bare, each crimson seal slicing into Claudine Harrow's pride like a blade. I rose to my feet, took a deep breath, and felt years of buried anger finally find a place to be released. My voice rang out steady, without trembling, without bitterness, carrying the conviction of someone holding the truth. "This is land passed down from my father and grandfather, not decoration for you. My family built this farm, built this dam, before Lakeshore even had a single brick. Every inch of this land, every stream of water here, is soaked in the sweat and labor of my ancestors. You don't get to bury the truth in arrogance, and you don't get to treat someone else's legacy like an ornament for your illusion of power." Before the echo of my words had faded, the hall erupted into applause. Clapping was loud, persistent. Some people stood, nodding continuously. A few longtime residents clapped until their hands turned red, their faces glowing with a mix of joy and release. Elijah sat in the front row, his eyes shining, lips pressed tight but unable to hide his pride. For the first time, My son saw his father stand up not just for his family, but for a whole community that had been oppressed too long. Claudine sat opposite, face purpling, hands gripping the edge of the table, eyes wild with rage as if trying to devour me with her stare. She opened her mouth to speak, but anything she tried to say was drowned out by the applause. The entire room had turned its back on her, something she had likely never experienced in all her years of absolute control over Lakeshore. As the clapping finally began to settle, a city official seated at the dais looked across the room and said, "Mr. Miller has presented legal documentation confirming his rights to the land and the water source. These records are clear, undeniable. From now on, all activity related to the lake and its water will need to be reevaluated." That declaration felt like a blade slicing through the rope that had bound my family for so long. I didn't need to look at Claudine to know she was speechless. Several residents turned toward me, some offering smiles they had never given before. One nodded gently, lips forming the word, "finally." Suddenly, Claudine shot up from her seat, scrambling to reclaim dominance, her voice sharp and cracking. "This is a disgrace. You're letting a farmer manipulate. You don't understand. I've been the one keeping this place valuable. I gave you property worth something. Without me, you are nothing." Her words fell flat, and this time, not a single voice rose in agreement. Instead, from the back of the hall, an elderly man spoke up, his voice clear and deliberate. "You kept your own pockets, not ours. That lake you were so proud of, we've now seen it was sustained by the Miller family's legacy. You never owned it. We've been deceived far too long." A swell of agreement rippled through the room. A young woman stood up, a small child in her arms, and added, "Jonas told the truth, and all you did was threaten. We don't need a leader who steps on others to feel tall." Claudine spun in place, her eyes darting for some trace of support, but met only shaking heads and cold stares. Face flushed, then turned pale. Her hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the chair. She forced a smile, but it twisted on her lip, revealing a collapse that could no longer be hidden. I turned to the official, bowing my head respectfully. "I don't seek pity. I just want the truth to be honored. If justice exists, then it must be fair to everyone, regardless of wealth or color." That line triggered a second wave of applause. Elijah stood tall, clapping hard, his smile wide. I glanced at my son, felt a new strength rising in my chest. This was no longer just a fight between me and Claudine. It had become a battle between truth and lie, between justice and abuse of power. In that moment, I knew the balance had shifted. Claudine might flailing, might still try to resist, but the truth had surfaced, and the community had seen it with their own eyes. Once trust is gone, power becomes nothing but a hollow shell, waiting to crumble. I sat down and breathed slowly. The sound of applause still echoed, but inside me, there was a calm I hadn't felt in years. A major battle had been settled, and ahead lay a new path. The path to reclaim justice, not just for my family, but for all of Lakeshore. After the city's investigation, an emergency meeting was held in Lakeshore's main hall. The hesitant looks and forced smiles gone, replaced by a palpable resolve. For the first time, the residents didn't just sit and listen to Claudine's manipulation. They stood up, one after another, to recount what they had silently endured for so long. A black man was the first to step forward, his voice lowered, hands slightly trembling as he held a stack of old citations. 3 times I was charged with aesthetically inappropriate vehicle placement, even though I parked inside my own garage. I paid the fines. I stayed quiet, afraid my family would become a joke, but not anymore. This was never about the truck. It was about the color of my skin. He handed the stack of papers to the investigation clerk, the rustle of the documents slicing through the room like the sound of lies unraveling. The hall fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. Next, a young woman stepped up, holding a file in her arm. Her voice quivered. "I was ordered to replace all my windows because they were not up to standard, but I walked past homes with far older, worse ones. The only difference? I'm a person of color. I went into debt to fix them, all because Mrs. Harrow threatened to sue me." Whispers rippled through the crowd. People looked at one another, started recalling, and started comparing. Faces shifted as the rumors they once dismissed began to materialize into undeniable truth. A young man stood from the back row, voice sharp. "I got fined for hanging my football team's flag on my porch. They said it disrupted the landscape. My white neighbor has flags up year-round and no one says a word. Is that just, or is the HOA's rule book only used people like me?" The room filled with murmurs of agreement. One by one, people came forward, sharing what seemed like small infractions, but together formed a mountain of injustice. An elderly woman brought forward a stack of citations, each stamped date. Every week, they found something new. My flower pot, the paint on my fence, even my granddaughters laughed. They were all violations. But other houses, they got a pass. The evidence stacked high. Papers that once forced families into silence now towered on the council table, exposing the truth. The clerk read aloud a few entries. Violation: planting unauthorized flora. Violation: children creating noise. Violation: laundry causing aesthetic disruption. With each line, sighs and angry mutters swept through the hall. I sat in the front row, listening, my heart heavy. It wasn't just me. So many families had suffered quietly, afraid of being cast out. Claudine had used that silence to fortify her power. But now, each testimony was a hammer blow against the wall of fear. Claudine sat hunched at the front, her face growing paler by the minute. She tried to interject, "These are isolated incidents. People are exaggerating to discredit me." But her voice was drowned by the rising noise of protest. One resident snapped back, "Isolated? Look at that mountain of fines. How many isolated cases does it take to become a system?" The hall erupted like a tidal wave. People were no longer afraid of Claudine, no longer afraid of the HOA. They had found their voices, and that voice was becoming a collect force. I looked around and saw in their eyes not just anger, but relief, as if a door long locked finally burst open. I understood that from this moment on, Claudine had lost more than her power. She had lost her place in the community, a place she once believed she ruled like law. And with every testimony, the truth carved itself deeper, impossible to wash away. The next day, the press covered the historic hearing in Lakeshore across every outlet. Photos of Claudine Harrow sitting pale-faced in the hall, a towering pile of wrongful citations in front of her like a mountain of accusations, flooded front pages. Headlines were everywhere. HOA tyrant unmasked, the truth about years of oppression in Lakeshore. People shared those images on social media, captioned with biting remark, "This is the face of greed. A pale suit can't cover a rotten core." In a live broadcast, a journalist projected Claudine's photo onto a massive screen, pairing it with a direct quote from the internal email. "Get that black family out of the lakefront by any means." The image instantly became a symbol, spreading across forums, leaving her reputation beyond repair. Claudine had once naively believed she could divert public attention, but now the media had turned her into a mirror reflecting unchecked abuse of power. It wasn't just public outrage. Fractures began forming within the HOA itself. A previously silent board member gave a statement to the local paper. "I cannot support Mrs. Harrow's method. We've gone too far." His words were the breaking point, triggering a wave of dissociation. Other members subtly distanced themselves, dodging questions from reporters, no longer willing to say Claudine represented the entire HOA. At the next meeting, the atmosphere was heavy. The council seats, once fully occupied, now had visible gaps. Some claimed personal matters for their absence. Those who remained no longer echoed her declarations in unison, eyed one another with suspicion. Claudine gripped the microphone, her voice hoarse from shouting, "This is a takedown plot, a smear campaign to destroy the community." But the more she spoke, the more isolated she became. I sat in the back, watching it all. I saw division creeping through the cracks of the power Claudine had built for so long. A few residents whispered right there in the meeting, "The HOA can't go on like this. We need change." Those whispers were now spoken aloud, no longer hiding in corners. Outside, op-eds kept asking hard questions. If a council formed to protect its residents becomes a tool for discrimination, does it still deserve to exist? People from other neighborhoods joined in, recounting similar experiences with their own HOAs. Lakeshore had unintentionally become the center of a broader discussion, with Claudine as the text villain. Elijah sat beside me, eyes glued to every article. He let out a dry chuckle and whispered, "Dad, she hasn't just lost her power here. Now the whole country is watching her like some kind of tyrant." I nodded, the weight of it sinking in, that what my son and I had endured had now become undeniable proof of a deeper truth. Claudine still sat there, trying to appear composed, but every word she spoke only made the cracks within the HOA more visible. She was no longer a leader, but a burden, a name tied to cruelty and excess, dragging the entire system down with her. And I knew from this point on, her downfall wasn't an if anymore. It was a matter of when. The atmosphere in Lakeshore changed by the day. In the past, whenever Claudine Harrow entered a meeting room, everyone would rise, smile politely, bow their heads, and clap as if she were an irreplaceable center of gravity. But since the truth came out, that image vanished entirely. Claudine now sat as nothing more than a shadow in the chair at the head of the table, a seat no one wanted to approach anymore. The members who once stood beside her now found every excuse to back away. Some claimed they had to care for family, and others submitted resignations due to public pressure. In reality, They all knew Claudine's ship was sinking, and no one wanted to drown with her. During meetings, the number of empty chairs grew. Once, Claudine opened her mouth to speak, only to be cut off by a board member who coldly declared, "I don't trust you anymore. I won't stay to defend a lie." Then he stood and walked out of the hall, leaving Claudine frozen in place. The media coverage only deepened her collapse. One morning, the press released files submitted to investigators by a former HOA member. The documents contained clear evidence that Claudine had embezzled maintenance funds for years. Money meant for road repairs and landscaping had been funneled straight into her personal account. Lakeshore residents read the report and were so outraged that many gathered outside the HOA office to protest. One man shouted, "We've been paying dues every year, yet the roads are broken, the lights are out, and the landscaping is a mess. Now we know where the money went." The roar of angry voices drowned out Claudine's screams that she was being framed. Elijah held the newspaper in his hand, looking at me with a mix of shock and fury. "Dad, all those years I had to ride to school over potholes because she pocketed the repair money." I placed a hand on my son's shoulder, saying nothing. The truth was too clear to require explanation. Claudine sat in her office with the door shut and the curtains drawn, but outside, the fury of the community could not be concealed. The same people who once praised her were nowhere to be seen. No more handshake, no more approving smile. She had been completely abandoned. I watched the scene from afar, feeling no satisfaction, only a strange quietness. Claudine had built her power on fear and deceit, and when the truth emerged, it all vanished. Now no one stood with her, no one shielded her. Her downfall hadn't come from a single blow, but from the steady retreat of those who once held her up. I knew this was inevitable, and once abandoned, Claudine was no longer a ruler, but merely a name tied to greed and lie, waiting to face justice. I sat in my small house, a stack of files in front of me, sent by residents and former HOA members. Papers spread across the table, bank statements, lists of missing maintenance funds, and piles of unjust fines. Each page felt like a blade slicing through the illusion of Claudine Harrow's power. I turned each sheet, marking key points in red, no longer fueled by anger, but with the calm of someone who knew they held every weapon they needed. I gathered everything into an old leather briefcase, carefully arranged and clipped tight with a solid metal fastener. Elijah stood beside me, eyes locked on every move. My son whispered, "Dad, these papers will end it all." I nodded and replied plainly, "Yes, this will be the lawsuit that makes her pay. There's no way back for Claudine now." The next day, I walked into the law office with that brief. The attorney, a man who had faced multiple HOA lawsuits opened the file and began reading. His eyes lit up. He said just one sentence, "We have enough to bring her down." That line struck like a gavel, confirming justice was no longer a distant dream, but standing right in front of me. News of my plan to sue spread quickly throughout Lakeshore. Residents whispered it to one another, and many came forward with additional evidence, photos, documents, receipts from unjust fees. One middle-aged man brought a notebook meticulously recording every time Claudine had promised repairs, and the money vanished. Each new piece of evidence thickened the file and made denial impossible. Meanwhile, Claudine was trembling under the weight. I heard she no longer dared to walk outside alone, as residents no longer showed deference but confronted her direct. Some yelled, "Give us our money back," and others shouted, "You stole the sweat off our backs." Claudine could no longer hide her fear. One afternoon, as I was leaving the lawyer's office, Claudine appeared at the gate, pale-faced with eyes blazing like a cornered animal. She rushed toward me, breathing hard, her voice shaking but laced with venom. "You think you've won, Jonas? Don't think a stack of torn papers can bury me. I'll get my revenge. I'll make you and your son regret." Elijah stood behind me. I heard him hold his breath. I turned and looked directly at Claudine. Her eyes flickered when they met mine. My voice dropped, low but steady. "You can threaten all you want, but the truth can't be bullied. You've ruled through fear for too long, but now you'll learn fear isn't your weapon anymore." Claudine bit her lip, her face twisted with rage. She turned away, stumbled as she walked off, muttering curses under her breath. I didn't need to follow. To me, that moment said everything. Claudine Harrow, who once shouted, "I am the law here," was now just a trembling shell, clinging to a power that no longer exists. That evening, Elijah sat beside me in the living room. He asked, "Dad, are you afraid she'll do something?" I smiled, ruffling his hair. "I'm not afraid. Someone who trembles while making threats is just admitting they've already lost." My son nodded, his eyes lighting up with calm. I opened the briefcase and looked over the files once more. Between those pages, I saw more than just evidence. I saw the story of a community, years of people being silent, countless moments of swallowing pride for fear of isolation. Now all of it had crystallized into these documents, these testimonies beings, this force strong enough to bring Claudine to her knees before justice. Night fell, and I sat on the porch, staring at the lake drained bare under the moonlight. I knew the legal battle ahead would be brutal, but I also knew the scales had fully tipped. Claudine could scream, threaten, but in the end, she was nothing more than a defeated figure flailing in despair. And I, Jonas Miller, see this through to the end, not just for my family, for all those who had stayed silent far too long. The trial came sooner than I expected. The county courtroom was packed, not just with Lakeshore residents, but with journalists too, cameras flashing nonstop. I stepped onto the witness stand, took a deep breath, and recalled everything I had endured. The crushed barn, the absurd fines, the lake drained to its muddy bottom, exposing the truth. My hands no longer trembled. All that remained was to resolve. I looked directly at the bench, my voice firm and steady. They destroyed my property, they discriminated against my family's skin color, and they forced this entire community to live in fear. This is no longer just my story, it's the result of a systemic abuse orchestrated by Claudine Harrow and the HOA board. A wave of murmurs swept through the room, heads nodded, and some wiped away tears. My attorney stood next, unfolding a thick case file. He read out each piece of evidence, his tone even and clear. Here are documents proving Mr. Jonas Miller's barn was demolished by a bulldozer hired by the HOA. These are the unreasonable citations issued over the years, disproportionately targeting families of color. And this, he paused, holding up a set of papers, is the legal proof of control over the old dam and the water's ownership that has never been transferred from the Miller family. The courtroom held its breath. He placed an old map on the table, stamped by the county court decades ago. The map clearly traced the water's flow from the dam into the recreational lake. He spoke slowly. Mr. Miller holds not just the legal right, but the sole key to the dam's release valve. The lake's lifeline never belonged to the HOA. They built an empire of authority on something that was never there. The murmur returned, louder now, like a rising tide. Claudine sat stiff across the defense table, face frozen. She wanted to interrupt, but the attorney continued. We also have internal emails with direct orders. Get that black family off the lake by any means. These words require no interpretation. They reveal, in plain terms, the discrimination, the abuse, and the greed. I looked around and saw residents bowing their heads, recalling years of silence. Some wept, others gripped their armrests, furious at their own passive complicity. Elijah sat behind me, his eyes burning like a flame, locked on me. When my lawyer finished, he turned to the judge and said clearly, "This case is not just about a barn, not just about a lake. It is a reminder that a community cannot be ruled by fear and bias. Power must rest on justice, not privilege." The judge took notes, nodding quietly. The room fell still, and only the sound of a pen moving across paper could be heard. Claudine stood up, trembling, trying to speak, but her voice cracked. "It's all lie. He's making this up to get back at I only wanted to preserve the community's value," but her words were drowned out by shouts from the gallery. A man yelled, "You mean your own pockets?" Another added, "You lost our trust long ago, Claudine." I stood still, needing no more words. The evidence had spoken for me, and the voice of the community now echoed louder than any accusation. In that moment, I understood the balance had fully tipped, and for the first time in years, justice was finally within reach. Claudine shot up, slamming her hand onto the table, scattering documents in every direction, face flushed red, eyes bulging with the look of someone unhinged. She shrieked, her voice shrill and slicing through clenched teeth. "He destroyed the lake. He's the saboteur, the reason this entire community lost its value. Everything he's done has been out of personal spite." Her screams rang across the courtroom, startling a few, but no applause followed, no agreement came. Instead, the eyes that turned to her were full of disdain. Some residents shook their heads quietly, murmuring, "She broke it all herself. Who's she blaming now?" The judge sat high above, his eyes cold and direct as they locked onto Claudine. He waited for her outburst to subside, then spoke slowly, his voice cutting through the room with undeniable finality. "No, Mr. Jonas Miller did not destroy the lake. He merely reclaimed what has always belonged to his family." The room fell silent, as if every breath had been held. Claudine froze, her face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The judge's words landed like a blade, slicing through every last excuse. Elijah sat in the row behind, his hand gripping the armrest, eyes blazing as he heard the ruling. My son turned slightly toward the neighbors beside him, catching their nods of agreement. I knew in that moment, Elijah felt just wasn't just an abstract idea anymore. It was real, right there before him. A reporter from the press gallery leaned forward, jotting the phrase, "He merely reclaimed what has always belonged to him," which appeared instantly on the live stream ticker. Outside the courthouse, crowd watching the trial on a giant screen erupted in applause, the noise rising over the hum of camera camera shutters. Claudine staggered, clawing for whatever authority she had left. She shouted, her voice choking, "If he wins, we'll all lose everything. He's an outsider. He never belonged here." But this time, her words didn't reach anyone. A resident rose abruptly, pointed straight at her. "You're the outsider now, Claudine. You betrayed the very people who trusted you. We don't need your rule anymore." The clapping returned, louder this time, spreading across the courtroom. I remained still, saying nothing more. The judge had spoken the truth that mattered, and the resident had delivered the rest. I looked at Claudine, the once arrogant woman who had declared, "Here, I am the law," now trembling, eyes darting, lips moving without sound, and no one listening. My lawyer calmly gathered the files and spoke with composure. "Your Honor, we did not come to destroy this community. We came to end a reign built on fear. Justice cannot be founded on greed and discrimination." He paused, glanced at Claudine trembling at her table, then added, "And today, justice has begun to be served." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years finally lift from my chest. Not because of a win or loss on paper, but because the truth had been spoken. Openly, undeniably, no longer buried. The entire room looked toward me, their eyes filled with respect. I knew the battle wasn't entirely over, but from the moment the judge spoke, the scales had tipped firmly toward justice. Claudine collapsed into her chair, fingers clutching the edge of her skirt, her eyes blank as they stared at the floor. Those who once defended her now turned away, avoiding her gaze. And I, Jonas Miller, for the first time since this confrontation began, could hold my head high, no longer feeling alone. On the final day of the ruling, the county courthouse packed to capacity, not a single seat left. Outside in the hallway, Lakeshore residents gathered shoulder to shoulder, everyone tense with anticipation. Television cameras lined the walls, journalists jostled for angles, and I sat in the front row, my hand resting on Elijah's shoulder as if to reassure him, though in truth I was trying to steady myself. The judge entered, and the room fell instantly silent. He opened a case file, his voice deep and firm as it echoed through the chamber. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, the court declares, "The Lakeshore HOA board is hereby dissolved due to misconduct, corruption, and violation of civil rights. Claudine Harrow, in her capacity as president, is held personally liable for the destruction of property, discriminatory practices, and misappropriation of maintenance funds. This case is referred to the district attorney's office, criminal prosecution." In that moment, the courtroom erupted. Applause thundered like waves crashing ashore. People stood to cheer, and some residents embraced each other in tears. A black man shouted, "Justice has finally arrived." The sound rolled through the courthouse, overpowering the judge's gavel as he tried to restore order. I turned to Elijah and saw his face glowing. He gave a soft, relieved smile, his eyes shimmering, and whispered, "Dad, we really won." I nodded, the weight of months suddenly lifting as if a burden had fallen off my shoulders. There was no bitterness, only peace. Claudine sat frozen, her face drained of all color. Her hands trembled, clutching the edge of the table, searching for stability that no longer exists. At the words, "criminal prosecution," she let out a choked gasp and collapsed into her chair. The armor of authority was gone, the applause silent, and all that remained was the figure of a defeated woman stripped bare before justice. Some residents turned to look at her, not with fear, but with a mixture of contempt and scorn. An older woman, once fined by her for placing a flower pot in the wrong spot, whispered, "She deserves it." Others nodded in quiet, unhidden agreement. Reporters rushed in, microphones outstretched. One asked, "Mr. Jonas, are you satisfied with today's verdict?" I looked straight into the lens, my voice calm but resolute. I wasn't seeking satisfaction. I was seeking justice. And today, justice was served, not just for me, but for every resident who was ever oppressed. The applause surged again, louder than before. Elijah stood with the crowd, clapping until his hands turned red, his eyes filled with joy. I knew my son would remember this moment forever, as proof that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to rise. Court adjourned, and people slowly made their way out. The atmosphere felt like a celebration. Neighbors shook hands, laughed through tears, and some families raised old HOA fines into the air, tearing them up right on the courthouse steps as if to lay the past to rest. That sight filled me with a feeling I had never known before: unity. I stepped out into the yard, a light breeze brushing past, and saw the residents gathering around. A man grasped my hand tightly and said, "Thank you, Jonas. Without you, we never would have dared to stand up." I returned the grip and replied, "No. This is a victory for everyone." I only sparked what people were already ready to say. In the distance, Claudine was being led away by police, her hands trembling violently, her vacant eyes staring at the crowd cheering around her. She was no longer a figure of authority, but a criminal about to face justice. Her silhouette faded from view, and I knew a dark chapter of Lakeshore had finally closed. Inside me, a voice rang out, clear and steady. Justice doesn't come from those who proclaim themselves the law, but from a community that dares to stand tall. And today, I saw that truth revealed, not just for myself, but for an entire generation to come. When the judge declared his final words, the courtroom erupted. Applause thundered without end, mixed with shouts of joy and choked sobs. I stood still, drew a deep breath, letting the sound pour into my chest. It wasn't just personal relief, it was the release of a community that had been suffocated far too long. Elijah sat in the back row, surrounded by Lakeshore residents, and turned to look at me. My son's eyes were shining, filled with a pride I had never seen in him before. His face was still young, but in that moment he looked startlingly mature, as if he had just witnessed a lesson no book could ever teach. I looked at him and gave a quiet smile. Amid the noise of the crowd, I could still hear my own heartbeat, slow but strong. I walked over, placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, and leaned in to whisper, "We won." Elijah didn't answer right away. He just wrapped his arms around me. I felt his shoulders trembling, not from fear, but from an overwhelming surge of emotion. For months, he had watched his family be humiliated, their property destroyed, and himself cast aside for simply being different. Now, he had witnessed justice unfold, not as a promise, but as a verdict, hard and undeniable. A few residents stepped forward. Some lightly touched my hand, others gripped firmly, and a few only nodded in silence. But in their eyes, I saw gratitude. They no longer looked at me as the one dragging down property value. They looked at me as part of the community, perhaps even the voice that helped them break free from fear. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of Lakeshore residents had been waiting since early morning. When the heavy wooden doors swung open, they erupted into applause. The sound so loud I had to stop in my track. Elijah looked up, eyes misted, and whispered, "Dad, are they really on our side now?" I nodded, my voice low and steady. "Yes, because the truth has finally won." In that moment, I understood that this victory wasn't just about taking Claudine down or dissolving a corrupt board. It was a declaration to my son, to every child in Lakeshore. No one has the right to define your worth based on where you come from or the color of your skin. Elijah walked beside me, his back straighter than ever. He was no longer the boy who hung his head in shame, but a part of the story of victory, of justice. I saw my own pride multiplied in the light of my son's eyes. I looked up at the sky, a gentle breeze brushing past. Amid the noise, the reporter's question, and the endless handshakes, I remembered only one thing. The words I had just whispered to Elijah weren't just for us, they were for all of Lake. We won, and that victory will echo for a long time, so that anyone who speaks of it in the future will understand that justice never sleeps, only waits to be awakened. After the trial, the reverberations of the verdict didn't stop within the courthouse wall. The entire state exploded as headlines flooded every paper. HOA collapses under abuse of power. Claudine Harrow faces criminal charges. Lakeshore residents reclaim justice. Images of the dried lake bed, dead fish strewn about, paired with Claudine's stunned face, were shared so widely that anyone could recognize it. It wasn't just the story of one neighborhood anymore. It became a symbol of resistance against injustice across the state. In the days that followed, my home became unexpectedly crowded with visitors. Neighbors who once turned away or stood silently while Claudine taped citations to my door now knocked to apologize. Some stood trembling on the porch, unable to meet my eyes, whispering, "I was wrong. I stayed quiet out of fear of her, but it was that silence that caused your family so much pain." I shook their hand, offered no cold rebuke, but my gaze held firm truth. I replied, "Silence is complicity." She could only run roughshod because people allowed her to. If someone had stood up from the start, there would have been no barn to bulldoze, no family forced into humiliation. Those words weren't vengeance. They were meant to convey the cost of silence. A middle-aged man who once laughed at me during a lakeside party now lowered his head deeply. His voice faltered. "I regret it, Jonas. I laughed to avoid being isolated, but now I see I added another wound to your family's suffering. Please forgive me." I looked into his eyes and nodded. Forgiveness won't erase the past, but it gives us a way to not repeat it. Elijah watched all this in silence from the window seat. He heard every apology, every handshake, and I knew he was learning something vital. A community's strength matters only if people speak up. I didn't need to lecture him. This transformation before our eyes proved the lesson better than words ever could. The press kept reporting on the wave of awakening. Other neighborhoods across the state began to reevaluate their own HOA boards. Some distant residents even drove in to share their own stories of HOA abuses and oppression. They said Lakeshore's victory gave them the courage to stand up, take action. I listened, knowing the impact of this verdict would extend far beyond one community. Every evening on the porch, I'd see neighbors stopping by to shake my hand, leaving words of commitment behind. A young woman said, "From now on, we won't stay silent. If injustice happens, we'll say so. Another added, our price was a dried-up lake, but at least we found our voice again. I nodded, thinking to myself, maybe the lake will take years to recover, but the spirit of the community has already begun to rebuild. And this time, it's not built on fear, but on truth. Elijah sat beside me, smiled faintly, and whispered, Dad, I believe this place will change. I tightened my grip on his shoulder and replied, it will, but only if people understand that silence is never an option. The aftershock of Claudine's downfall wasn't just the collapse of a corrupt figure, but the awakening of an entire community. And I knew the voices that had just risen would carry farther, louder than any command that had ever been imposed before. After months of struggle, I returned to the land where my family's barn once stood. The ruins were still there, splintered wood tangled in weed, remnants of the destruction Claudine and the HOA had inflicted. But this time, I didn't look at them with helpless eyes. I saw them as the foundation for a new beginning. I got to work rebuilding the barn. My calloused hands gripped every hammer, every beam. The sound of pounding echoed across the land, no longer a cry of pain, but the rhythm of revival. The wind blew in from the drained lake, carrying the sour scent of mud, but I paid it no mind. That was the past. The task now was to rebuild what had been lost. Elijah stepped out, arms full of timber. He set it down beside me, sweat beading on his brow, but a smile played on his lips. My son, who once sat silent in the corner when humiliated, now stood tall, shoulders firm. He wasn't just helping me, he was carrying the work forward, proving that he too was part of reclaiming our family's pride. We worked from dawn until dusk, beam by beam, nail by nail. Every strike of Elijah's hammer landed so solidly as if driving out months of pent-up pain. I watched him, and in his eyes, I saw no bitterness, only a new belief. He hammered and laughed, then looked up and said, Dad, this time the barn's going to be stronger. I paused, looked at him, feeling something unspoken rise in my chest. I placed my hand on his shoulder, gripping it tight, my voice low and steady. It will, and no one's going to touch it again. The words I spoke weren't a promise. They were certainty. We had walked through filth, endured humiliation, and fought in open court. No one would ever again wield false power to strip away what was ours. That evening, as the frame of the barn took shape, Elijah sat on a high beam and laughed out loud. His laughter rang out, erasing the darkness of past days. I looked up and saw the sunlight gleaming off his face, radiant with the truth that we had made it through. Neighbors passed by and paused to watch her rise. Some nodded, one patted me on the shoulder, and another smiled quietly at Elijah. They didn't say much, but their eyes said enough. This time, the Miller barn wasn't just a structure. It was a symbol, a testament that justice, though delayed when it arrives, stands strong as freshly driven beam, unshakable. And in the rhythm of hammering and woodlocking into place, I felt my heart grow light, as if freed from invisible chains. Elijah sat beside me, his hands dusty with sawdust, his eyes shining. I knew, from this moment on, our family wasn't a victim anymore. We were the ones who stood firm, who rebuilt from the wreckage, and proved that no one could bury our dignity. That afternoon, I sat on the old wooden chair before the porch, eyes fixed on the drained lake. In front of me lay not the blue waters Claudine once flaunted, but a cracked, muddy bed scattered with dead fish, foul smell lingering everywhere. What was once the HOA's proud symbol had become a painful scar, exposing their greed and arrogance. Seeing it now, I felt no regret, only a truth etched in a haunting image. Elijah sat down beside me, his gaze turned outward to the mud. He was quiet for a long moment, then turned to me and asked in a solemn voice, Dad, do you regret turning the valve and causing the lake to disappear like this? His eyes were both curious and serious, as though he needed an explanation not just for himself, for how future generations would understand my act. I sighed softly, but a half smile played on my lip. I met Elijah's gaze and answered slowly, no, because sometimes, to teach a tyrant a lesson, you must open the valve. They destroyed our family's work, humiliated our skin color, and treated this community like pawns. If we didn't act, they would have continued. You must understand that justice doesn't always arrive gently. Sometimes it needs a powerful blow to wake a tyrant. Elijah remained silent, then nodded. The innocence of his early days was gone, replaced by understanding forged from hardship. He turned back to the lake, lip pressed tight, then quietly whispered, then she deserved it. Hearing that made my heart ache, not with pain, but because I knew my son had learned the hardest lesson, that sometimes reclaiming justice requires sacrifice. I looked at the lake one last time. Though only mud remained, I knew this place would heal, water would return, fish would swim again, and the community would be changed. But the memory of what happened, of a Claudine who ruled with arrogance and fell before justice, would never fade. It would stand as a reminder that no one, however proud, can trample human dignity without paying the price. I rose and placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. We turned away from the muddy lake, but in my heart, the story had ended with one echo: she deserved it. And that was the truth both Lakeshore and the state would remember for years to come. Looking back, I understand that Claudine's power never came from herself, but from the silence that blanketed Lakeshore. Every time she posted an unjust fine, every insult that exposed discrimination, people knew it was wrong, yet chose to look away. It was that bowed silence that fed her counterfeit authority. When Elijah and I chose to resist, when the video, the internal emails, and the legal evidence came to light, the entire community woke up to the fact that silence had meant complicity all along. And once they began to speak, that rotten power structure collapsed swiftly. Elijah, my son, is the greatest witness to that transformation. From a boy who once asked through tears why everyone seemed to hate him, he grew up in the very heart of this fight. He saw me stand up to injustice, saw me hold my head high in court, and saw truth triumph over lie. The lesson Elijah carries is not just the pain of being targeted, but the belief that dignity can be challenged, yet never taken away if we dare to defend it. The final verdict against Claudine and the dissolution of the HOA held more than legal weight. It was a warning. It reminded us that any organization, when built on greed and prejudice, will inevitably fall. And when power is used to oppress, it is the community itself, through unity and truth, that becomes the unshakable force standing against it. But beyond that victory are the lessons I hope to leave behind. The first lesson: silence in the face of injustice is the most dangerous form of consent. People often choose safety to avoid trouble, but that safety is always bought at the cost of someone else's freedom, and eventually their own. The second lesson: justice sometimes requires bold acts to be heard. Turning the valve wasn't just retaliation. It was a warning that what's dismissed can become powerful when pushed to the edge. Fairness has a price, and those who abuse power must the consequence. The third lesson: real strength in a community doesn't come from rules imposed by a select few, but from solidarity. When individuals came forward, when the once silent admitted their part, that strength shattered what once seemed immovable. And finally, the lesson for the generations to come: a person's worth isn't measured by skin color or possessions, but by how they protect their own dignity. Elijah saw that clearly, and I believe he will never let his own son bow his head the way he once did. Now, our barn has been rebuilt, the lake will slowly return, and the Lakeshore community has changed. But the memory of Claudine Harrow, of the fall of an arrogant symbol, will always remain as a reminder. Every tyrant pays a and justice, no matter how late, always finds a way to rise. Elijah once said, "She deserved it," and that too is a fitting final word to this story. A story of resilience, of the power of truth, and of ultimate justice.